Hello everyone. Last week we focused on the Abravanelian play, the Messianic play, which gave us in Act 1, 2 and 3 clarity into understanding what is meant to happen. And we spoke about the coming together of the 10 tribes, we spoke about Gog and Magog, or the war between Christendom and Islam, and we spoke about the key role of this active, human-chosen Messiah, son of Joseph. And then enter these enigmatic figures, Diego Pires-turned-kabbalist Shlomo Molcho and David ha-Reuveni, and this dynamic duo that perhaps more than any convey the tension between Messianism and Zionism, both historically and within scholarship. We didn't get into the influential, consequential, or coincidental relationship between the two. Indeed, these figures are enigmatic when it comes to understanding history and their role played in Messianism and potentially proto-Zionism. Where I'd like to begin today is where history becomes clearer. And I'd like to take us to a young girl who already had her bat mitzvah, the time David ha-Reuveni comes into Portugal. And I'm talking about Chana Nasi. Chana Nasi, or some of you may know her as Dona Grazia or La Signora. She's very well aware. She is around and present, part of Portuguese aristocracy, Jewish Marranos at the time that David ha-Reuveni comes and all what is going on. And what's fascinating is that a few decades later, Chana Nasi and a relative of hers, Don Yosef Nasi, will try and do something that potentially no one had succeeded better before them or even after them, until including Herzl. And that is Chana Nasi. She takes over her late husband's empire, a spice trade from Lisbon to Venice, but it's not only a spice trade, it's not only a business route. It is what allows Marranos to flee, to get out from Lisbon to Venice and scattered to freedom in other places in Europe. But that's not enough for Chana Nasi. Chana Nasi puts the money, the philanthropic money, behind the first Bible, which is printed in Ladino, in order to rekindle the Jewish neshama, the Jewish spirituality within these Marrano Jews. A contemporary rabbi at her time dedicates a book to Chana Nasi and says, do you want to know who this woman is? Take all of the female prophets in the Bible, put them together, this is Chana Nasi. I would argue, and based on the little historic chapter we are going to describe, Chana Nasi could also be described as Moses Montefiore, Theodore Herzl, and James Bond put together. In fact, it is all the prophets put together. Chana Nasi gets this idea that it's not enough to allow Jews to be in Europe, to have a Bible, to be able to rekindle to our past. Jews need a homeland. Jews need independence and sovereignty. Chana Nasi and Don Yosef Nasi secure a deal with Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, and they buy Tiberias. They buy Tiberias, they start building walls, creating security. They even import silkworms to try and compete with the fashion industry in Italy, and things are happening. And the entire Jewish world is talking about this. Everyone wants to come, predominantly Italian Jews, but there is a lot of talk about this. And we're talking about 1560s. This is only a few decades after what Reuveni and Molcho tried to do. Is there a connection? Is there no connection? This matters not. This is an attempt at restoring Jewish sovereignty for the Jews. This is what one could argue to be a foreseer of a form of independence, what will later become with nationalism a state. And yet with the early death of Chana Nasi and Don Yosef Nasi, the idea fails and comes to its demise. We will close this curtain and begin our session today with one question. Is it coincidental that just a year or two after Chana Nasi's attempt, Rabbi Isaac Luria, one of the greatest Kabbalists, comes out of his metaphoric cave in Egypt to head where? To the northern part of Israel, to Tiberias and to Tzfat, to begin his Messianic yearnings. But this still is part of, although we can begin talking about clear history, there is much debate in scholarship. What do we call this? If we look at one of the pioneering scholars on Zionism and the Zionist idea in Jewish nationalism, Professor Jacob Katz, he would argue this might be Zionist idea, but it's not Zionism. Because Zionism requires the birth of nationalism. This is a late 19th century idea. We're talking about the 80s and the 19th century. This was the definition of Jacob Katz. This was what allowed Professor Katz to say, Zionism only begins in Zionists late 19th century. And moreover, you need a calling. You need someone that goes together with you. And here, Katz identified the difference, as we mentioned in our first session, between Herzl, who had an audience, and these other figures that didn't. But the question that we ask ourselves is this a question of definition? Are we talking about, or should we be constrained to the way one historian views Zionism and Messianism? Or much like scholars like Professor Moshe Idel and others who we'd mentioned, had touched upon the confluence and the potential connection between the Messianic idea, or what Idel calls political Messianism, and Zionism. So in this sense, we are going to move on now to our next character, who, this was Sokolov's first Zionist, if you recall, and yet this first Zionist for Sokolov was mentioned by Katz as no such thing. This is simply not possible. In fact, Katz went so far as to say that those scholars that mentioned David ha-Reuveni as a Zionist, like Professor Aaron Zev Eshkoli, were too good a Zionist in order to not view him as such. So we have complication, we have tension, but enough of that. We are now in 17th century, early 17th century, mid-17th century Amsterdam. Who was Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel? The best way to introduce, I think, this figure is think Rabbi Lord Chief Jonathan Sacks, had he been interested in Kabbalah. I think this is a good representation. We are about to meet a figure who, on the one hand, is internally one of the greatest preachers and storytellers the Jewish people have, and yet he is also an ambassador advocating the importance and the confluence of Jewish ideas and ideas that the world at large is interested in. And yet there is a difference between Sacks and Manasseh ben Israel, and what brings Manasseh ben Israel closer to the figures that we are dealing with in the series. The family history. We are talking about horrific torture in the Portuguese Inquisition. Manasseh ben Israel's parents, his family, went through torture. When I say horrific torture, I mean imagine a father and mother who are put in separate chambers because a few years ago someone had said someone fasted on a certain Jewish fast day, and you were trying to force the wife to tell on the husband that they had done something. And one is going through a wheel of torture, and you have the Inquisition's physician, his sole purpose to check when is the border of they are alive and now they are dead, and therefore we should stop the torture. We are talking about a horrific background, but they get out. They manage to escape. It's not clear where Manasseh ben Israel is born. Professor Menachem Dorfman wrote a wonderful biography and research on this figure, as did Cecil Roth. Many papers have been written about this figure. According to Professor Ilan Yassif, he is potentially, we can view Manasseh ben Israel as the first to delve into the research of Jewish folklore. But there's one bit that has been touched upon that we are going to delve into further, and that is the mystical outlook of Manasseh ben Israel. And I'd like to begin by viewing his view of history, which, as we are going to see, is very similar to Abravanel and very similar to the actions that inspire Shlomo Molcho and David ha-Reuveni. Now, when we say mystical outlook, I'm not sure we could call Manasseh ben Israel a Kabbalist, but he did write a Kabbalistic text. He wrote Nishmat Chaim. One of the few books that he writes in Hebrew is all about reincarnation, the Jewish doctrine of reincarnation, based on Lurianic Kabbalah. It's a newfangled version of that. As I mentioned, he creates this confluence between ideas at the world at large and internal Jewish ideas. He's a prized pupil at a very young age. When the family reaches Amsterdam, he becomes a teacher, a preacher. He's very poor. Coming from nothing, one of his greatest achievements is to marry Rachel. Rachel is the great-granddaughter of Don Yitzchak Abravanel. And this This is very, very powerful for Manasseh ben Israel, as Dorfman notes. He then opens a printing press when they have several children because they're not making enough money. And I want to focus now, because there are many things we could talk about Manasseh ben Israel, but time is of essence. I want to focus on 1644 and 1655. Because 1644 is the year that everything is going to change for Manasseh ben Israel. It is the year a figure by the name of Antonio de Montenezos, a Marrano, much like Ben Israel, arrives in the town of Amsterdam, and he has a story to tell. He's been to the Americas, and he's seen indigenous tribes that, to his mind, the way they pray, their rituals, they're the lost tribes. The Jewish court in Amsterdam do not buy de Montenezos. But Manasseh ben Israel wants to look into this, because Manasseh ben Israel, as a fan of Don Yitzchak Abravanel, something has changed since the time of Abravanel and the time of Manasseh ben Israel. As you recall, at the time of Abravanel, there is the idea, Columbus has sailed out. We are beginning to discover a new world, and yet the testimonies slowly come in. But by the time we reach the early mid-17th century, we have discovered a new world. We have map makers like Ortelius, cartographers. We have the findings of Columbus and others. And what Manasseh ben Israel is going to do is he is going to listen very carefully to de Montenezos, or AKA Aaron Levy. And he's going to write a book called Mikveh Israel, first in Spanish and then translated into Hebrew, where he is going to try and epistemologically understand, what are we talking about? How can we know if really this is the case or not? And why is it so important? And how will it inspire Manasseh ben Israel's Messianic action plan in 1655 to convince Oliver Cromwell to let Jews back into England? And this is how his book begins. Among many sound opinions, it is difficult to find the most truthful opinion. And you, esteemed ones, request that I explain to you the tale and testimony of Antonio de Montenezos, and to know for certain the source of the Indian and the New World. This is what we are out to achieve. This is what we want, what we wish to find out. And this is something that cannot be attained intellectually, because no one has given us any knowledge of this, nor is it possible to grasp the divine with divine intellect. Right? Manasseh ben Israel says, what tools do we have when someone comes and says, I saw something? What can I do? For before they were discovered and these countries were found by Christopher Columbus, no one remembered or wrote a thing about this. We're talking about a new world. So how can I go to Isaiah, to Ezekiel, to Malachi, to future lands and places they are talking about when I don't know what they're called or where they are? How can I create this confluence between the Jewish prophets and between the scientific world of Manasseh ben Israel's time? And this is what he set out to do. This is what he wants to do. He is going to create a connection between what the world is talking about and discovering today and what Jewish history or what prophets have told us. You should know that the 10 tribes were not exiled at once. As I wrote in my book, The Consolidator. So the Consolidator, again, not written in Hebrew. Most of Manasseh ben Israel's books, he really is writing to a non-Jewish audience to consolidate between the supposed contradictions within the Bible, that the king of Assyria exiled the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh ben Israel is going to now get into this, what Abravanel gets into. We know that we were scattered. We know that this took time, and therefore we were put into very different places. And as such, Manasseh ben Israel is trying to establish this idea that it just makes sense that only slowly, as the divine history unfolds, the appearance of these 10 tribes will begin to happen. And so he talks here about, on the one hand, what Isaiah is talking about. Haran, the river Gozan, these different places that we don't know about, but we know that Jews were scattered there. And he connects it with the fact that some of the 12 tribes dwell in Ethiopia. There is no doubt about this from the words of the prophet Isaiah, as it is written, "Woe to the land of clamorous wings, on the other side of the rivers of Cush, which send agents into the sea in papyrus vessels upon the surface of the water." I want to stop for a moment and focus on this Isaiah 18, Hoi Tziltzal. because it's fascinating that Don Yitzchak Abravanel views this very verse. He says, what is Isaiah talking about? Where is this enigmatic place? And he says, do you know where it is? It's on the banks of a river within Lisbon. I identify it. So for Abravanel, he takes Isaiah as a future prophecy, which is talking about contemporary Portugal. Inspired by this analysis, Manasseh ben Israel will say, in my time, how am I meant to view this eternal outlook on the Bible and the words of the prophet? And he says, in my time, the way I understand Isaiah is he's talking about different travelogues that meet Jews beyond the river Cush. This is Ethiopia. These are the Jews. This is the land that Isaiah was talking about. And Manasseh ben Israel will go through Jews in Kaifeng and everything that the world has found, including de Montenezos, and he will put it bit by bit to say, look what's happening. If Don Yitzchak Abravanel told us a precursor to active Messianism, to the happily ever after, is the discovery of the 10 tribes coming together and choosing Messiah, son of Joseph, then this figure that views history mystically will say, or Kabbalistically, will say, I see it. I see it unraveling. Something is happening. And by the way, when he mentions cartographers like Ortelius, he brings testimonies of Ortelius that Ortelius knows about David ha-Reuveni. And Manasseh ben Israel will correct certain versions of the story. But the point is that Manasseh ben Israel is collecting any bit of information he can to show that essentially what Abravanel said is happening in our day and age. And they're all over. The West Indies, China, the borders of Tartar, beyond the rivers of Sambatyon. Here said the prophet, he will raise a banner from the nations and assemble the castaway of Israel. Here is where we can begin to talk about the peak of Manasseh ben Israel's, or the fruitation of his idea. Once I have seen the dispersion of the tribes, and they begin to pop up like mushrooms in winter all over the world, he then recalls a verse that tells us that on the one hand we have Judah that will be dispersed among the four corners of the earth. Judah are the Jews that are known of, and Israel that are cast away, the ones that we don't know about, they're going to start popping up. And he says, guess what? The cast away are popping up. But now he's going to ask himself, but have Judah been dispersed among all the nations? Have we done what needs to happen for the next chapter, for the next act in the Abravanel Messianic play? Attention should be paid to the fact that he calls Israel cast away and Judah dispersed. This is going to become a big thing for Manasseh ben Israel, because he is going to focus here on the difference between the two and say, do you know why the prophet says cast away? Because much like in our time, even within Spain, new peoples are being discovered. This is the essence of the 10 tribes. Because they were scattered gradually and bit by bit historically, these are the cast away and they're beginning to appear. But the question regards the four corners of the earth. He says, regarding Judah, the prophet says that the Lord shall gather them from four corners of the earth. And indeed we see today that they have synagogues in America, right? He sees this is happening. But slowly Manasseh ben Israel is going to start to realize, and this according to many scholars, this becomes, especially Sokolov, this becomes his favorite idea, as we mentioned. There's only one place that Jews have been kicked out of and not allowed back in, and that's Britain. That's England. And then it'll come into Manasseh ben Israel's mind, this is what we need to do. Now make no mistake, interestingly, Messiah, son of Joseph, for Manasseh ben Israel, is precisely the Messiah, son of Joseph of Abravanel. And this is not a small point, because as we see with the characters we are going to view, our next figures, like Mordecai, Manuel, Noach, Yudah Bivas, and Yudah Al-Kalai, we talk about an evolving Messiah, son of Joseph. But here with Manasseh ben Israel, the matter of redemption he accepts, we shouldn't get into when it's going to happen. And yet, he clearly identifies, according to sources, that Messiah, son of Joseph, and some say Messiah, son of Ephraim, is this chief of staff, military chief of staff, identified by Abravanel. And this, of course, comes into play with the Maimonidean King Messiah, as well as the Nachmanidean commandment to conquer the land, because you're going to need someone to help you do this. But interestingly, this is not going to be the sort of the idea that for Sokolov becomes Manasseh ben Israel Zionism. What Manasseh ben Israel will do is I'm not that figure, so to speak. He's not thinking he's that figure. He's not a military chief of staff. His family have been persecuted, but he does want to do his bit, and it's diplomatic and political action. And so what happened in 1644 with the Montenezos coming in to the gates of Amsterdam and the writing of Mikveh Israel manifests itself. The fruitation of this into action is 1655, when Manasseh ben Israel, after tragically he loses one son and another son, he wants to go to Oliver Cromwell, to the Lord Protector of England, and make the case, advocate that Jews should be allowed back into England. And the idea is that once this happens, Judah has been dispersed to all four corners, so indirectly this is political, diplomatic action towards reinstilling sovereignty, albeit within a Messianic frame. First and foremost, this is how it begins. And by the way, he wrote this in English. What we're reading here is the English Manasseh ben Israel wrote to Cromwell. First and foremost, my intention is to try, by God's good hand over me, I may obtain here for my nation and liberty of a free and public synagogue. I want freedom of religion, wherein we may daily call upon the Lord of our God, once he may be pleased to remember his mercies. Right, what we want is freedom in what Manasseh ben Israel identifies as the great country of his time, England. But it becomes more than that. Because Manasseh ben Israel is going to say, why is it that it has to happen in England? He's aware of the Messianic question and of the Jewish question that is the talk of the time in England. And here he will try and create this bridge between the Messianic idea that is being spoken about in Britain or in England and the Jewish Messianic idea. And here we speak about this prerequisite. It is known, he says, look at the verses in Daniel, the Jews must be dispersed. This has to happen. We must come in order for the Messianic plan to fulfill itself. Otherwise, this can't happen. And he keeps on with he also, if in Mikveh Israel, if in 1644, the talk of the 10 tribes is where we find Manasseh ben Israel as the passionate religious preacher, this text, this hope of Israel, this advocacy to Oliver Cromwell should be viewed more, according to Dorfman, as the sort of legal counsel in Manasseh ben Israel. It's advocacy. He's coming and saying like a lawyer, look, it's known. Jews, countries they get to, you're going to be better off. It's going to be good for your economy. It's part of the Messianic plan that you believe in yourself. We all have a vested interest in this happening. In the end, Manasseh ben Israel tragically dies in 1657, and Cromwell has not yet given a positive yes. But several years later, and according to biographers, it is potentially thanks to the action of Manasseh ben Israel that Cromwell will decide to let Jews practice religion freely in England. And this is what Sokolov identifies then as essentially what creates an internal culture that allows the very Balfour Declaration. So we close curtain now on Manasseh ben Israel. And one of the main reasons why we begin this session with Manasseh ben Israel is because our next character, to my mind, could be viewed as the 19th century American manifestation of Manasseh ben Israel, no less. In fact, as we will slowly discover, one could argue or one could question whether Mordecai Manuel Noach at times perhaps thought, listen carefully, that he was maybe the reincarnated soul of Manasseh ben Israel. The actions are so similar. The influence is so apparent, both explicitly and implicitly. So who is Mordecai Manuel Noach? But before that, notice that we've jumped from the 17th century to the 19th century. Why the gap? Very simply, a Sabbatean movement has occurred, a false Messiah movement that has created such a devastating trauma that no one dares for so long to try and get up and do anything and it takes time. It requires a new region, a new area, and this manifests itself in Mordecai Manuel Noach. What we call him, I'm not sure. Professor Jacob Katz would call Mordecai Manuel Noach potentially a charlatan, someone that you could not imagine to call a Zionist. If you ask Professor Jonathan Sana, who wrote a very important biography on Mordecai Manuel Noach, then he is trying to, he's a restorationist, he is trying to bring Jews back, and he has this idea. Sana is very loyal and faithful to Katz's definitions of nationalism and Zionism, or Jewish nationalism. We have, of course, also the great biography of, already before that in 1936, of Isaac Goldberg, of Major Noah. So who was Mordecai Manuel Noach? Mordecai Manuel Noach was 1/4 Portuguese. And yet it was the quarter he loved most. Sana notes it was the quarter he spoke about most. Mordecai Manuel Noach will become a journalist, a playwright, the sheriff of New York, the U.S. consul to Tunisia. This is one of these larger-than-life characters. And as a playwright, as a dramatist, he knows very well to tell stories. And for him, the story of his quarter Portuguese is of the utmost importance. And with due respect, because unlike Manasseh ben Israel, the escape story of the Nunez family, the branch from which part of Mordecai comes from, is no less than an epic Hollywood movie scene. We're talking about a physician very well off, unlike Manasseh ben Israel's family, and the Inquisition doesn't really allow Jews to get away, but because they are very well off and needed and important, and the great-great-great-grandfather is an important physician, so they're allowed to stay on their estate. And yet they escape. An amazing, amazing story. There's, boats, there's a pretend party, they leave, get to London, and from there we head to Georgia, Savannah. And slowly the family reaches Philadelphia, and Mordecai Manuel Noach is born into a family. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, is Jonah Phillips, who fought in the Revolution. He's a very good mate of none other than George Washington. In fact, according to some testimonies on Mordecai Manuel Noach's Ketubah, one of the signed testimonies is none other than George Washington. He becomes a friend of the second president of America, John Adams. This is a person that knows people, that is well connected. He is fighting for the place of the Jew in America. Democracy and Judaism is what is important to Mordecai Manuel Noach. Our story begins after Mordecai Manuel Noach has become, he turned into the consul, the ambassador of the U.S. in Tunisia. He's very quickly brought back to America. It's a bit controversial what happened, we won't get into it, but he writes a travelogue. While he was ambassador, he visits France, Spain, England, North Africa. To this day, Sana notes, his travelogue is considered the best picture we have of Tunisian Jewry in 19th century. So he sees the Jewish world. He comes back and inspired by what he's seen, inspired by the huge discrepancy between the potential for Jews in America and what he saw in Europe and North Africa, our first stop is a speech he gives, or a drasha, in the oldest synagogue in North America, She'erit Israel, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. It's in the inception of the second building of this synagogue, and Mordecai Manuel Noach gives a speech. And what's fascinating here is that much like Manasseh ben Israel, and much like Abravanel, and the figures we have focused on, we are going to very clearly notice the mystical, Kabbalistic influence of viewing history. It is not history that just happens, the Maimonidean rational history, but we are talking about divine fingerprints all over. And make no mistake, Mordecai Manuel Noach identifies the very creation of the United States of America as an event with a capital E, something that has divine providential fingerprints all over it, and it's important for the Jewish question. He begins his speech with, going back to the oppression and noting, isn't it amazing that Jews have survived? Isn't it amazing that after all of the oppression and all that has gone on, on this occasion, right, after he surveys this horrid history, we reach a point in time where Jews have finally reached a place where, how does he say this? It has pleased Almighty God, whose unity and omnipotence we have never ceased to acknowledge and defend, to direct a portion of his chosen people to this land of toleration and liberal principles. What is Noach saying? He's saying, do you want to know how I arrived in America? How my 1/4 Portuguese, how the family, the Mishpucha, got here? It's divine providence. It's a mystical view of history. Make no mistake, but it's not only that, meaning not only does God or divine providence bring to the great liberal country that is America, but it also ensures that Jews will get to America because something has to happen. Remember, we spoke about the confluence between this mystical or Kabbalistic view of history and then what requires action. So in enjoying blessing of light and liberty, we have seen permitted to erect this place of worship to this honor, right? The very fact that we're in this synagogue and we're allowed to be doing what we're doing today is all about the way divine providence works. And then he goes back to the Roman period and how all of these other nations are no longer here. And notice one of the most fascinating things he says, and the only miracle now on earth, right? One must ask, someone that views history as divinely influenced, what is your thought on miracles? Can the supernatural actually really happen? And notice what Mordecai Manuel Noach says. The only miracle now on earth, the most positive evidence of divine protection, is at this day the preservation of the Jews. Noach is saying, do you want my proof that God exists? The Jewish people exist against all odds. It's almost as if, one of the most favorite quotes that in Jerusalem Jews like to quote is Mark Twain's view of Jews as, going against any law of stats. It doesn't make sense that the Jewish people exist. It's almost as if Mark Twain read this, right? Because here Noach comes and says, it just doesn't make sense. Look at the grand nations, how we were dispersed, where we went. Notice how he talks about that after 2,000 years of persecution and suffering, we are more numerous than the period of our dispersion. We have been dispersed, and yet we arise strong. This makes no sense. This is divine providence in action. Our country, right? He's a proud American and a proud Portuguese Jew. The bright example of universal tolerance, of liberty and arrangement of our civil code. Here, no inequality of privileges, merit alone has fixed value. This is true democracy, Mordecai Manuel Noach will say. You only find it in America. Until Jews can recover their ancient rights and dominions and take their rank among the governments of earth, this is their chosen country. Here they can rest with the persecuted from every clime, secure in person and property. One might get the feeling from here that Noach is trying to sort of think of a potential Uganda plan, that this is where Jews should be in the country, in America, until restoration. But then we reach the continuation of the speech, which is rather odd. And in the continuation of the speech, Mordecai Manuel Noach speaks about stats. And after coming back from Europe and North Africa, he says, there are upward than 7 million Jews in the world. I've checked. And guess what? Not only are we very well off financially, but we can wield sword and we can bring 100,000 men into the field. Now I ask you, what is the purpose of mentioning this? Is it just to mention a stat? Or is this a seasoned politician and diplomat that's trying to test the waters? He's trying to see on the ground, could this idea work? What will happen if I tell Jews in Manhattan, guess what? We have enough for an army. And yet, you have to have your allegiance to America. Surely Mordecai Manuel Noach knows better than to come and say, let's rise up and fight. This is very tense. We just had the revolution not long ago. And yet, this is what surfaces. What is Mordecai Manuel Noach getting at? Let us hope that the day is not far distant when, from the operation of liberal and enlightened measures, we may look towards that country where our people have established a mild, just, and honorable government accredited by the world and admired by all good men. If I had to conclude this first stop in the thinking of Mordecai Manuel Noach and whether we call what is going to become a Zionist idea, in fact, even according to Professor Katz, we can talk about a Zionist idea. Is it a Messianic idea? I want to emphasize several themes in this 1818 speech, because if we want to understand the thinking of Mordecai Manuel Noach, we have to strip and bring together the different bits and pieces from his speeches and his discourses. And what we find here is first this unique view of history. History is the divine unfolding. This is clearly inspired by the mystical or Kabbalistic view that history is in fact the divine, and we use the prophets to understand. It is our map, our compass, to understand what needs to happen and what we have to do. And one could argue that one interesting thing here is that Mordecai Manuel Noach is very carefully trying to test the waters. Could we potentially think about this idea of a military? I'm not sure. The next issue is, notice he talks about the importance of the Jewish people. The reason the Jewish people need to be in America already in this speech is because they need to understand governance and what a democracy is. And we're going to get to that in our next stop. But I want to highlight that. This idea that we are talking about an honorable government is a very important point for Mordecai Manuel Noach. And one could even argue that his writings today are of the utmost importance with a question regarding a Jewish state, a democratic state. But we'll put that aside. And the final point he makes is the importance of the Hebrew language. And here we already have we can begin to talk about or smelling nationalism, the importance of the Jewish people coming back to having their own language, which will better define themselves and differentiate themselves from other nations. We close curtain on this one-off speech. We don't know what to do with it. And in the meantime, Mordecai Manuel Noach, the clock is ticking and he's thinking. And we reach 1825. What leads to 1825 and to, Israel Zangwill, the great writer and Zionist, he'll write a famous short story, Noah's Ark, inspired by this very event. And it's all about Mordecai Manuel Noach trying to create, one could view his own Uganda plan in America, but as a temporary plan, as a temporary state, as a temporary country, but for specific reasons. And in 1825, Mordecai Manuel Noach, or before 1825, he will write letters to all of the leading figures in Europe and in the Jewish world saying, come. Now, one could argue he makes a little mistake by appointing himself the judge of the Israeli people. This isn't quite going against rule number one of Jewish Messianism. He doesn't say he's Messiah. He doesn't say someone's Messiah. But to call yourself a judge, that's not really going to help. But he does get some positive responses from a leading figure in Vienna and Switzerland, and he gets the feeling that perhaps Jews are going to come. He invites American Indians, who he thinks are part of the 10 lost tribes. On a given day in September in 1825, dressed in a purple velvet costume, riding on a horse, it could have been white. It was taken, by the way, the purple velvet gown by the leftover of a Shakespearean play. He enters into Ararat. What is Ararat? It is a land that he has bought in America, in New York, in Buffalo. He tries to first convince the US administration, give me land for a temporary country for the Jewish people. In effect, there is an uncanny resemblance between what Manasseh ben Israel tries to do with Cromwell and what Mordecai Manuel Noach tries to do with the US administration by saying, let the Jews in. He's taking it a step up. He's saying, let them in and let them have a little shtickle state. But it's not very far off. In fact, according to some testimonies, Mordecai Manuel Noach would sometimes sign his name Manasseh. But this, we have yet to prove this, but it's an interesting or curious historic fact or enigma. In any event, he writes the letters and he wants to create this temporary state. So it's even better than the Uganda plan because from the very get-go, it is not meant to be permanent. And he writes the letters and the show goes out on play, and it's called, this country, this temporary country is called Ararat. right after you know what, and you're viewing here the very plaque that has on it Shema Yisrael. And he gives a speech on this given day where unfortunately you can hear more crickets than you can hear people. The Jews never come, as they never do. But what is fascinating about this discourse is we have here Mordecai Manuel Noach's rationale for why we potentially need a temporary state. And here one could talk about or question his prophetic ability to see what is going to happen to the Middle East, what is going to happen to Jewish demography, what is going to happen to Israeli politics. Let us begin. Having made known by proclamation the reestablishment of the Hebrew government, having laid the foundation of the city of refuge, notice he says Hebrew government, an asylum for the oppressed in this free and happy republic, I avail myself to unfold the principles and explain the views and details. The Jews have been destined by providence to remain a distinct people. Right? He continues with this. The Jews have never ever will relinquish the just hope of regaining possession of the ancient heritage, and events in neighborhood of Palestine indicate an extraordinary change of affairs. Make no mistake, Mordecai Manuel Noach foresaw the fall of the Ottoman Empire, foresaw the Brits coming into Palestine, foresaw the rise of Jewish demography in America. A lot of things Mordecai Manuel Noach, he had a sense. Called together to the Holy Land by slow but unerring finger of providence. Right, this is gorgeous. The unerring finger of providence. The Jews coming from every quarter of the globe would bring with them languages, habits, prejudices of each country. What we have here is Mordecai Manuel Noach saying, do you know why I think we need Ararat before we come to Israel? Because of what's called in Hebrew, hashed ha'adati. He foresaw the ethnic tension between Yemenite Jews, Polish Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Russian Jews. He writes about it. He says, what do you expect? You're going to have Jews coming, and you're going to have someone coming and saying, right, let's have a melting pot, and that's really going to work? Forget about it. We need to first come to, and what he fears most is that if you do that, you're going to start bickering and fighting, like in the first and second temple, and we know how that ends. So there is logic here. You could argue with it, but it's fascinating. He says we need to first come to a temporary state. There is logic, meaning one could almost argue that for Mordecai Manuel Noach, it's a necessity to come to America first in order to get rid of this ethnic tension between different languages, but between the different sidurim, prayer books, what we have today. View it today. Think of the Jewish world today. You know, the man knew what he was talking about. And the diversity of opinions and views would create fractions as dangerous and difficult to allay as those fatal ones, as we mentioned. In this country that the government of the Jews must be organized, here, under the influence of perfect freedom, they may study laws. Here we come into the second reason. The first reason for Manuel Noach that we need Ararat is the ethnic tension. The second reason is he says, what do you expect? Jews haven't practiced politics for 2,000 years. You don't know what statesmanship is. You expect to come and you think you're not going to have elections every 2 years. You think you're going to have a period where you're not going to have elections every half a year. You know nothing about politics, Mordecai Manuel Noach says, because it takes time to learn a Westminster system, a democratic system, put it into play, test it. This is why potentially Mordecai Manuel Noach has been pushed in the dustbin of history, but potentially he needs to be taken out, and the thought on Jewish and democracy, Mordecai Manuel Noach, is of the utmost importance. In 1837, this isn't really a stop, but I bring this discourse because it really is a homage to Manasseh ben Israel. This is where we see the influence at its best. Noach writes a discourse about how the American Indians are in fact part of the 10 lost tribes, which will ring a bell because this has Manasseh ben Israel written all over it. He has read the works of Manasseh ben Israel. And in this discourse, Manuel Noach begins by saying, look, it's not possible that Jews are dispersed historically, we know this, and that you just vanish, you disappear. You have to pop up somewhere. And he continues and says, look, Manasseh ben Israel wrote his celebrated treatise to prove this fact on the discovery of America, that they are going to be found because it's not possible to suddenly disappear. Notice how he calls Manasseh ben Israel the most learned of the nation. This is his inspiration. He wants to be like Manasseh ben Israel. If there are the remnants of the 9.5 tribes which were carried on into Assyria, we're slowly going to find them. And it's just a matter of time. Where are they? They're in America, they're all over. But one of the most fascinating bits in this discourse is the following. My faith does not rest wholly in miracles. Providence disposes of events. Human agency must carry them out. That benignant and supreme power which the children of Israel have never forsaken has protected the chosen people amidst the most appalling dangers, has saved them, right? It's time for us to do something. Our goal, our role is not solely to wait for miracles. That's just God saying, I've opened a window of opportunity, but now human agency has to carry them out. And by 1845, Mordecai Manuel Noach realizes that Jews are not listening. So he goes to his next audience. Because Jews are not listening when he says the Jews must do something for themselves. They must move onwards to the accomplishment of the great event long foretold, long promised, long expected. And when they do, that mighty power which has for thousands of years rebuked the persecution will bring them. This is no less, make no mistake, than a Kabbalistically infused idea of actions below create actions above that then lead to actions below. But Jews don't listen. So by 1845, Mordecai Manuel Noach will shift his attention to speak to Christian Americans. And here he does something fascinating. He will, on the one hand, try and correct Christians and say, you don't read your own prophets. You need to understand that the goal is not to be a missionary to turn Jews into Christians, because your own writings teach that when your Messiah comes back, he's going to come back to Israel, Palestine, and there'll be Jews there that are practicing Jews. So what are you doing? So he's going to tell off the Christians, and then he's going to tell off the Jews. But by saying to the Christians, do you know why I come to you? I come to you because the Jews will never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But before that, his very intro is to come and say, like in 1818, 30 years ago, it's still crystal clear to Mordecai Manuel Noach. He wants to tell Christians, do you realize that you living in the United States of America is a divine event? I, as a Jew, am telling you this. This is extraordinary. Do you realize, do you connect the dots between this divine event called America and what's going on in the world? He tries to paint this picture which says, you, the greatest nation, liberalism, democracy, your role is to help the most despised, poor nation that has run from one trouble to another. Your goal, as divine providence would have it, is to save that very nation. This is part of your Messianic prerogative. And where does he prove this to them? Where does he prove this? Right? He will go to the prophet that Christians love the most. But we're going to skip a bit of this to get to the very best bit. Because essentially, Mordecai Manuel Noach will take the very same prophetic bit in Isaiah 18, Hoi Tziltzal, that did it for Abravanel, and Abravanel interpreted as Portugal of his time, that Manasseh ben Israel identifies as Ethiopia, an evidence that the lost tribes are coming back, and therefore the Messianic process is in the making. Mordecai Manuel Noach will say, do you want to know where Hoi Tziltzal is? Do you want to know where that land is? It's America. Hail to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the river of Ethiopia. The prophet in this vision was in Palestine, having Europe on his right, Africa on his left. And in the front, the Mediterranean Sea, and so looking down the northern coast of Africa speaks of a land which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. I have referred, that land is America. But all lands spoken of in the Bible have a distinct name. How is it that the prophet Isaiah only speaks of it as a land? Right? There's a problem here. The same problem Manasseh ben Israel had. If it's a prophecy, say it's America. But it was not discovered at the period of the prophecy and consequently could not have a name. It is our Western world and can mean no other. The arms of no country are so emphatically wings as those of the United States. It is an eagle in the act of flying with outspread wings. Right? We need someone like Samuel Jackson to read bits like this. Peculiarly conspicuous as an memorial and sign and living description of our land, which under the shadows of her wings offers shelter for the persecuted of all the nations. Mordecai Manuel Noach closes his last attempt at instigating what one could call a Messianic son of Joseph process as trying to identify the United States of America as divine providence in action, saying, your goal, your role to bring on the happily ever after is to bring us back to Israel. And in that sense, he's doing something very similar, indirectly, to what Manasseh ben Israel is doing. We close curtain here. We've shifted from Messianism to the actions of Mordecai Manuel Noach, where one could question, with a question mark, is it Zionist idea? Is it Zionism? Is it proto-Zionism? Right? If Katz said you need a following and there's no following here, does that mean this doesn't exist? Or what if at the time there was no following, but what if in the 21st century all of a sudden Jews become engulfed with the writings of Mordecai Manuel Noach and they become of the utmost importance for what a Jewish democracy looks like? Would then Katz say that perhaps this changes something? Sure, then there's the problem of Jewish nationalism, but the point is we close curtain here on our domino effect of figures that tell a different story, a different narrative, a contesting narrative, without having to trouble ourselves with how to define exactly Messianism or Zionism, but Jews that got up because believed something had to happen, and each one saw it in a different way. Next session we will continue on even closer towards Kabbalistic Zionism. Thank you very much.